The moment I heard about the PowKiddy RGB30, I knew I had to buy it. Not because of its hardware capabilities, although it can handle a pretty good amount of emulation for the price point, but no, it's because of its niche quality. And yes, I'm referring to the very large 1:1 aspect ratio screen. Immediately I think about Game Boy and how amazing it would look like on this screen. Yeah, the Game Boy is not a perfect 1:1 aspect ratio, but it's pretty darn close. The Game Boy Color was the first console that I've ever owned as a child. I remember this Christmas of 1998, and I was a 5-year-old kid wanting nothing more than a Game Boy and Pokemon Blue to go with it. Well, lo and behold, Christmas rolls around. It's a very wintry, snowy Christmas, if I remember correctly, and Santa left me a nice red Game Boy Color and Pokemon Blue to go with it under the tree. In fact, it's this Game Boy right here. I remember turning on that Game Boy and Pokemon Blue that Christmas day and literally couldn't figure out how to get out of the first building. Like, my 5-year-old brain couldn't comprehend it. I put so many hours into that little red Game Boy, hundreds and hundreds of hours, struggling through games, getting over this learning curve, but I had so much fun, and it was my companion in the car, at restaurants, at home, in bed, you name it. Anyway, I was immediately drawn to the RGB30 because of my love and nostalgia for the Game Boy Color. So I went ahead and bought the RGB30, not really knowing much about it at all. But I gotta tell you what, I was excited to test this bad boy out. Is it everything I ever imagined? How beautiful will it make Game Boy look? And what else is this console good for? Because the PowKiddy is more than just a Game Boy emulation device. After testing this console out for about 100 hours, I have a lot to say. Without further ado, let's get into the meat of this video. PowKiddy, what to expect? I knew that PowKiddy had a reputation for not being the best of quality. After all, they're generally the budget option for handhelds. Aside from a couple tweets I saw from other YouTubers talking about how cool this device was, I really was going blind when I purchased my RGB30. Because this device was so unique with its rather niche screen, I just had to try it out for myself. My first thought when pulling this device out was, holy cow, that screen is big, and I love it. I really like how the screen extends from top to bottom with hardly any space on top and bottom. The screen also takes up a lot of the side-to-side real estate, leaving just enough room for the controls. Honestly, very impressed by this. Now for the rest of the console, being a PowKiddy device that's cheaper than your average console, I was expecting cheap material. However, this device is oddly a mix of what I would call premium feeling material with cheap material. Let me explain. The shell has a nice matte feel to it with a grippy texture on the front. I would call this premium feeling. But then you have the top shoulder buttons and the start and select button, which kind of feel cheap and clicky. They also rattle a bit. Not much to say about the rest of the face buttons and the D-pad and the joysticks. They aren't the most premium feeling buttons, but they aren't bad either. Also, the device feels less compact than my more expensive handhelds feel. This device supports 2 SD slots, one for the OS and one for the games. It will come with the OS card inside already installed with JELOS. You'll need to buy a second SD card for your ROMs. On top, we have our micro HDMI port so that you can play on the big screen, and the power button, reset button, and volume buttons. Quick note about the volume button. I find the increase and decrease of the volume with every press of the button is a couple levels too many. It's hard to fine-tune the volume to what I want it to be. When I'm lying in bed and I need to keep my volume at a reasonable level, I find myself stuck between the volume that's too loud and a volume that's too quiet. On the bottom, we have a C port charger, 2 micro SD ports, again, one for the OS and one for games, a headphone jack. This device also has Bluetooth, which means you'll be able to pair controllers to it and connect it to a TV and essentially treat it like a home console. I tested this feature out, more on that later in the video. Finally, the RGB30 has Wi-Fi. Personally, I'm a big fan of this because I like to play with retro achievements turned on, which you will need Wi-Fi for. When my RGB30 arrived, I wanted to test it out with the stock OS it comes with, which, as I mentioned earlier, is JELOS, aka Just Enough Linux operating system. My goal was to have as simple of a setup as possible, and honestly, it was super simple. All you need to do is boot up the device with a fresh SD card inserted into the second SD slot, and the device will automatically flash that SD card and create ROM folders to add your games to. Power off the device, take the SD card out, and then put whatever games you want into their respective folders on the SD card. And that's it. You can start gaming. Quick side note though, if your RGB30 comes with a generic card with JELOS, you might want to purchase a name brand card and flash JELOS onto the card. It's a simple enough process, and I recommend checking out Retro Game Core's startup guide on the RGB30 to learn more. Luckily, my device came with a name brand card, so I didn't have to worry about that. Chances are your device will come with a name brand card as well, especially if you purchase from the same place I did. By the way, I purchased this SD card here, but any name brand will do. Don't worry too much about the speed of the SD card. That doesn't really matter for retro gaming. 64 gigabytes was plenty for me because you won't really be downloading any larger files like PS2 or GameCube files. You will also need a micro SD card reader for your computer. I purchased this one because I needed a USB-C adapter. If you're using USB, then I recommend this one. All these products will be linked in the description below. When you start using the RGB30, you're going to be blown away by the quality of the screen. I knew that this 4-inch 1:1 aspect ratio was going to make retro games look good, but I was shocked by how bright, crisp, and clear the image quality was on this device. Now, I'm no expert on screens, but I know from experience playing on a bunch of different devices that I know what looks good and what looks great, and the RGB30 just looks fantastic, okay? Now, maybe my expectations were low because the price tag, and also because I was expecting it to be made with kind of cheaper components, given that it's PowKiddy and all. But when I first turned it on, I was shocked. The OS that the system came with was an outdated version. I did not update it when I started playing, which I think may have been a mistake. More on that in a little bit. The first system I tested out was Game Boy. I knew that it would look great, and honestly, I just couldn't resist. So I decided to play through Pokemon Yellow, and oh my gosh, I don't think there's a better way to play Game Boy at this time. Aside from maybe the Analog Pocket, but as you probably know, it's oftentimes out of stock, and plus it's way more expensive. The RGB30 is only $90. Game Boy Color is even more gorgeous, as I discovered when playing Pokemon Silver. The vibrant colors and the large, crisp display is a real treat. The young elementary school Paul would have killed for technology like this. Actually, I probably wouldn't even care because kids don't care about things like nice displays. We were content squinting at a non-lit Game Boy Color screen. I tested out a couple other Game Boy games like Cave Noir, which is a really cool Japanese-only release game that is essentially a roguelike. And I also played through Kirby's Dream Land 2 for the first time, and that was fun. Now, obviously, functionality-wise, Game Boy and Game Boy Color is going to have no problem playing. I mostly want to emphasize how great the screen is optimized for these consoles. I will say though, I ran into an annoying issue while playing Pokemon Yellow. The system crashed 2 times. This happened to me after longer play sessions. However, when this happened, my RGB30 running JELOS was out of date. Since I fully updated my console, I have not run into the freezing issue again. At least, not yet. The last thing I'll say about Game Boy and Game Boy Color. You can optimize the scaling and visuals to make the pixels look more crisp. Personally though, I prefer playing with the default settings and integer scaling set to off. I like utilizing as much of the screen as possible, and even though the pixels are technically not as crisp and uniform as they could be, I'm honestly just used to the settings here. Game Boy Advance also looks really great on the RGB30. It's not as remarkable as Game Boy simply because of the more stretched out aspect ratio, but still, if you're planning on buying this device, rest assured that Game Boy Advance is still great on it. I played through the Minish Cap and had a ton of fun. Alright, let's talk about SNES, because I was shocked by how good SNES looks on the RGB30. In fact, SNES looks so great on the RGB30 that's possible it looks even better than Game Boy. You do want to change a few scaling settings first though. Don't worry, it's super simple. I'll walk you through the settings here. Go to Game Settings in the JELOS menu, then Per System Advanced Configuration, then click on Super Nintendo. Now, make sure you set the aspect ratio to 8:7 and then turn integer scaling on. Next, turn on an SNES game. Any SNES game will do. Now you'll see that the screen size is very small at first, but we can do a thing called integer scale overscale. Shout out to Retro Game Core for his guide demonstrating this. Once your SNES game is booted up, click on the RetroArch menu, hit B and go to Settings, then Video, then Scaling, and turn on Integer Scale Overscale. Then go back to the quick menu, scroll down to Overrides, and hit Save Content Directory Overrides. This will make sure your overscale is set up for every SNES game. Once you go through these settings, SNES is going to look amazing. For NES, we also want to do a quick scaling change. Again, in per system advanced configuration, switch scaling to 8:7 ratio. This will fill up the screen a lot more and the pixels look really nice. I can't get over how amazing retro games look on the RGB30. With the RGB30, there's a lot of tinkering you can do with the scaling settings on this device. Now, ultimately, it's going to come down to personal preference. Sometimes integer scaling makes sense and it just makes the screen a little bit smaller, but it makes the pixels more perfect. While other times, integer scaling makes the image too small and you're not taking advantage of that large screen. Again, it's all personal preference. I recommend tinkering with the settings and find out what works best for you. And finally, this is the last thing I'm going to say about scaling, but that is you can totally ignore all the advice I gave you about scaling. I mean, honestly, the default settings on this device make everything look great, and you really don't have to change anything at all. It's just personal preference. I know a lot of you like a plug-and-play device with minimal setup, and if that's the case, just keep the default settings the same. All right, Pico 8 looks amazing on the RGB30. I recommend you get it set up. To do that, go to the Pico 8 website, and then actually purchase their product. It's $15, but you get infinite downloads, and plus, I mean, for unlimited games, it's a good deal. Download the Raspberry Pi version. Then all you got to do is copy the files from the folder of the download to the Pico 8 folder on the RGB30. And that's it. Once you boot up your RGB30, you can go to Pico 8, click on the Explorer option, and then you can download and play any game you want from Pico 8. It's amazing. Recommend you do it. So DS, on the other hand, this is what I was really curious to see. When it comes to DS emulation on retro handhelds, it's hard to get DS games to look good without having to play on a single screen and toggle between the top and bottom screens. This is because the DS screens are meant to stack on top of each other, and most retro handhelds have a wider aspect ratio that make the screens teeny tiny to see when it's stacked vertically. I was kind of hoping that the RGB30's 1:1 aspect ratio would make DS games look better since its screen is taller than most handhelds, but unfortunately, it's just marginally better. Plus, there's no touchscreen, which you need for a lot of games, as you can imagine. You'll have to use the right joystick to move the stylus around, which is kind of janky. While playing Advance Wars Days of Ruin, I encountered this strange glitch where the environment a unit was standing in or flying in would switch during the battle animations. This might have been a ROM issue, but I have played this same ROM on a different device and it worked fine, so I'm not sure. N64 performance on the RGB30 is a little dodgy, at least with JELOS. I've tinkered with the settings, used standalone emulators instead of the RetroArcs, but I still get stuttering with a significant amount of games. It's not that you can't play them, it's just slightly annoying and might turn people off from N64 gameplay. However, after doing research online, I read from multiple sources that N64 gameplay is significantly improved if you install ArcOS on your RGB30. I didn't install ArcOS because honestly I really like JELOS and I was going for a simple install. But if you'd like to see how much better N64 plays on the RGB30 using ArcOS, let me know in the comments and I'll make sure to make a future video on that. Dreamcast tends to be a pretty easy console to emulate, so I wasn't surprised that I got really smooth, consistent gameplay while testing out games like Sonic Adventure 2 and Rayman 2. I was also using the RetroArcs Dreamcast emulator as well. Generally speaking, RetroArcs emulators, or what they call cores actually, don't run as smoothly as standalone emulators, so that's a good sign. Also, I wanted to point out that I played the Japanese version of Sonic Adventure 2 for the first time, and I kind of low-key prefer the voice acting in the Japanese version, although I can't understand any of it, so it's not that very convenient. Like Dreamcast, PS1 also played great. I was using one of the RetroArch cores as well, so I could earn retro achievements on these games. Also, I should note that I use the default setting for both Dreamcast and PS1. I didn't change anything. I didn't tinker any of the graphic settings at all. Unfortunately, in my experience, PSP is just not enjoyable. I even mess around with the graphic settings, but still, there's just too much stuttering and too much slowness. If you are planning on purchasing an RGB30 for PSP gameplay, you want to look for something more powerful, such as the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus. Alright, let's talk about the HDMI output and Bluetooth settings. First of all, the Bluetooth settings are very janky. I was unable to connect my DualSense 5 controller or my Xbox One controller. But I know it's possible because other people online say they've done it. I don't know why it won't connect for me. I'd love some feedback in the comments if you know. You can, however, connect a controller via USB-C with the second USB slot. So I connected my DualSense controller that way. Mapping the controller is a bit tricky. When you get to the end here with the analog sticks, the text is cut off, so you have to use your detective brain a little bit. Look at the pictures of the direction on the left and right analog options and press the direction matching the picture. Once you have a controller connected via USB-C, you can kind of get a home console going, but you'll only be able to connect one controller that way, so you won't be able to do any multiplayer. Maybe if I install ArcOS on a different SD card, I can get Bluetooth and multiple controllers working that way. Again, I might just have to make another video just setting up ArcOS on my RGB30. Let me know if you'd like that in the comments. So over the last couple months of playing on the RGB30, I did come across a couple of bugs. Keep in mind, I've only used JELOS because it was the easiest way to set up my RGB30, and I wanted to make a video testing this console out on the most accessible way to play. You may not experience these bugs with a different firmware. The freezing issues. I briefly described the freezing issues when talking about my Pokemon Yellow playthrough. My game froze 3 times, twice while playing Pokemon Yellow and once while playing the Minish Cap. Since updating JELOS, I haven't experienced these issues. The next bug had to do with sound. One time I booted up my RGB30 and there was no sound coming from the console. I could faintly hear a dull buzzing sound from the speaker if I put my ear up to it. This made me think that there should be sound coming from the device. On Reddit, someone said that they could turn on the sound on and off by pressing the L3 and R3 buttons at the same time. I turned the device back on, did this, and the sound started working. I will say this could be totally coincidental because I was on an ArcOS forum. Might have nothing to do with JELOS. Maybe the sound just decided to start working again for whatever reason. Who knows, but I haven't had this issue since, so I'm not too concerned about it. Finally, and probably the worst bug of all, placing the console in sleep mode drains the battery. I first noticed this when placing the console into sleep mode overnight, and the battery was totally drained the next day. I wasn't even in a game, I was just in the JELOS main menu. Unfortunately, it hasn't been fixed with any updates as of yet. You'll just have to be consistent about powering the device off when you're done playing. It is an inconvenience for sure, but sacrifice I am willing to make for that beloved screen. I took a chance purchasing the RGB30 and I do not regret it at all. I love this device and I can confidently say that I'm going to keep playing it moving forward. There were a few things that concerned me, such as the relatively cheap build, the freezing issues, the sound issues, and the sleep function issue. But these issues seem to be resolved with JELOS updates, and if not, then honestly there's just things I'm willing to deal with for that lovely screen. Aside from the actual build, of course, which is not something you can change, but I mean for $90, I don't mind it. What you purchase the RGB30 for is that screen. It is the most valuable asset this device has to offer. It's large, colorful, crisp, and the perfect aspect ratio for retro gaming. Unless you're ready to fork over $220 for the Analog Pocket, there isn't really a great alternative out there. Yet, at least that I'm aware of. I can't stress enough how amazing this screen looks on the RGB30. Really, the video can't do it justice. It looks so amazing in person, especially when it comes to Game Boy and SNES. So if you're looking for a fairly affordable way to play the classics on an amazing resolution, as well as some N64, PS1, Dreamcast, and PSP, this is a device for you. The RGB30 made by PowKiddy. I love this device. I put in around 100 hours of playing into it, and it's held up really well. Now, that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed the review. I'm going to go play some more RGB30. Have a good one. Have a good one. Oh my gosh. Gotta get better at the outros.